Welcome to Whose Line Is It Planarcadia, where everything's made up, and is anyone else wondering why there are jokes if the jokes don't matter? No? Just me? Okay, maybe it's a little too early in the video for nihilistic philosophy, but in that case, maybe we should just move on, because our latest quest came with a lot of twists, turns, and transformations that I cannot wait to get into. And why waste any more time on these silly little introductions when we can get right to the point and kick off episode 4 of our Planarcadia recap with a brief reminder of the events of episode 3. So after the Phantasm Moon announced changes to the game's grand prize, the Nameless turned their attention towards investigating Fullwish. Poking around Graphia Academy revealed that after graduation, Fullwish traveled off-planet to study cognitive science on a garden planet, where she ended up developing the theory behind happiness surgery, although she wouldn't finish developing the procedure until she returned to Planarcadia years later and got her hands on bits of Shuhu's flesh that were left over from the previous Herald of Death incident, courtesy of Asat Pramad's meddling, of course. And as their investigation wrapped up, Fullwish appeared and invited all the supplicants to a televised debate at Seafeld TV Tower. It was obviously a trap, but it was also the perfect opportunity to confront Fullwish directly. But going into something like this unprepared is unwise, so the Trailblazer asked Sparksy to investigate Fullwish, and at the World's End Tower, she was able to uncover and experience Fullwish's happiness syntax ability before making a very hasty escape. Armed with knowledge of Fullwish's abilities, the supplicants then traveled to Seafeld City, where they discovered that most of the residents had undergone happiness surgery and could fall under Fullwish's control at any time. So Evanescia decided to step in and tried to use her authority as arbitrator of the Phantasm Moon Games to pass potentially lethal judgment on Fullwish. Only problem was, Fullwish wasn't the main supplicant, Shuhu was, which meant that everyone who had a fragment of Shuhu's flesh inside of them would also be considered Shuhu by the rules of the games. In other words, any happiness surgery recipient, all 200,000 of them, which meant passing judgment on Shuhu could potentially kill over 200,000 innocent people. And even if Evanescia didn't pass judgment, possessing the flesh of Shuhu put those people at risk of becoming denizens of abundance anyway, which could potentially draw the attention of Lan, who would be more than happy to blow them up alongside the entire planet, which is bad. So Blade offered himself up as a sort of sacrifice. If the crew could just find a way to extract all of Shuhu's bits from all these innocent people, then he could serve as the host and target for Evanescia's judgment, theoretically ridding the world of Shuhu and the Herald of Death in one fell swoop. Although things don't quite go to plan, but we'll get to that. But with that loose plan in place, everyone went to Seafeld Tower for the debate, where Fullwish framed the IPC and the Astral Express, pinning the crimes of the Herald of Death on them and even claiming that Sunday's Harmony power was responsible for the spread of the Abundance mutations, which was very convincing because she then broadcast her happiness syntax ability from Seafeld Tower, and the resulting Joy Ascendant transmission messed with the synesthesia beacons within the happiness surgery recipients throughout the city, causing them to mutate into denizens of abundance. Meanwhile, Pearl tasked Silverwolf with locating the source of the transmission signal so that they could shut it down. But then she ran into a bunch of meanie kitties, so imaginae that were born from the synesthesia beacons of the mutated happiness surgery recipients. Those meanie kitties then tried to fuse into a brand new Phantasm Moon for some reason I still don't quite understand, and I probably don't need to understand it because Silverwolf took them all out by borrowing the power of her future self. And that would be the end of it, except Asat Pramad decided to show up. And he, of course, is the true mastermind behind everything. But Silverwolf had expected this since Kafka had been late when they met briefly before her investigation started. Her lateness meant that something had gone wrong with the script Elio provided them, and Asat Pramad took credit for that. He does have some loose ties to the finality, so it is no surprise that he has some ability to mess with the script a little bit. And while all this was happening, the Trailblazer and co managed to corner Fullwish at the top of Seafeld Tower. But with the full backing of Shuhu behind her, she was more than a formidable opponent. She flung the Trailblazer off the tower, and as they fell, their mind projected into the Phantasm Moon courtyard where Evanescia's alter ego greeted them. The Evanescia that we are familiar with broke the only taboo of the game and told Yao Guang about how a husk of Ouroboros is sealed within the world on canvas, which disqualified Evanescia from participating in the games. And it also woke her alter ego, who was going to pass judgment on both Evanescia and Shuhu. Fortunately, she never had to do anything because the Trailblazer managed to bargain for more time, and used that time to gather all the available wish power they could within their Stellaron, which allowed them to properly step onto the path of elation and take Fullwish down for good. But the immortal Shuhu was still alive, and also still scattered in fragments amongst all of the happiness surgery recipients. So Sunday used his tuning ability to remove Shuhu's bits from all of the infected individuals, then fused them into a giant tree, which is the true form of Shuhu. Silverwolf then compressed the tree with ether editing and placed it inside of Blade for safekeeping. The only thing they had left to do was pass judgment on Shuhu, but rather than have Evanescia do it, Yao Guang suggests using the husk of Ouroboros instead, and sends Evanescia ask the Trailblazer to deliver a message to Graphia, who is somehow still alive after 1,000 years inside the world on canvas, which is also where Ouroboros' husk is. The world on canvas is our next destination. Now, Yao Guang's plan is rather simple. Ouroboros, the Veracity, is capable of devouring anything, so logically speaking, it should be able to devour Shuhu regardless of Shuhu's immortality. But while the details of this plan are very unclear, Blade has agreed to participate. Normally, Yao Guang would go with him, but she's a bit preoccupied with her own plans on how to counter Asat Pramad. Now, this anti-Ravager plan came about because of the intel that Kuchiba gave to Pearl. Apparently, she noticed that Asat Pramad deliberately left some clues behind in a rather catch-me-if-you-can kind of way, so Yao Guang decided to do just that. Using the Xianzhou Calicocra Sky Plume Spiritist that she commands, Yao Guang intends to weave a giant web around Planarcadia using the Sky Plumes made from Welt's Hersher of Reason ability. Now, this ability has hardly been mentioned in Star Rail, but back when he was in Honkai Impact, Welt had the ability to recreate anything he understood the construction of. That was like his main thing, not the black hole. The black hole is like a separate weapon, divine key thing. His actual power is the power of creation, and that's the power being used here. And honestly, I hope they use it more because it's severely underutilized. Now, this web, which Yao Guang calls the Deca Light Reflection Barrier, allows her to read the planet's threads of fate and monitor Asat Pramad's movements precisely, at least in theory. But if the theory holds, then they might be able to predict and prevent some of his actions, which tips the scales of fate in their favor. Now, I'm really curious as to how this will play out in a future patch because Asat Pramad's primary ability appears to be probability manipulation, so Yao Guang's prediction models are gonna have to account for that. And we won't know whether or not it works until next patch. So there's that. Now, while Yao Guang is busy setting up her trap, Ashveil and March are investigating Asat Pramad over at the World's End Tavern. And there's two things that Ashveil is trying to figure out here. The first is Asat Pramad's history so that he can get a better feel of who we're up against. And the second is Asat Pramad's connection to the Veracity, since most of his plans regarding Planarcadia involve the Veracity husk that's sealed there. But questioning the fools of the tavern only earns them a story about some fools who stole the Veracity's tongue. These fools are named Shepherd, Braggy, Dorothy, Scarecrow, and Enroute, and most of these names are thinly veiled references to the main cast from The Wizard of Oz for reasons I don't understand. But ultimately, their line of questioning leads them to the conclusion that the masked fool named Enroute did something to the Veracity long before Benzai Tengoku was attacked by the Legion. Benzai Tengoku being the ancient name for Planarcadia, in case you forgot. Now, Sampo also tells them that Enroute resigned as a masked fool during the Second Prosperity, which, for context, was an era that happened just after Emperor Rupert I was defeated, but before the rise of Rupert II. Now, Sampo also mentions that before Enroute vanished, he allegedly said, "The elation has been dead for a long time," which is both ominous and interesting because in this same conversation, we finally learn all three ways to kill an Eon. The first way is for one Eon to outright destroy the other by force. The second is for one path to engulf the second. And the third, which is new information, is for an Eon to willingly turn away from their path. Now, given the proximity of information, I wonder if we can assume that Aha turned away from their path and revoked their Eonhood, because wouldn't that be an interesting twist? It is certainly possible, but there is another perhaps more convincing way for an Eon like Aha to die? But let's put a pin in that for later, because Sampo still has more to tell us. According to him, Enroute said that his destination was the true World's End just before he vanished. Before Ashveil can put the pieces together, Ruan Mei and Ting Yun arrive at the tavern to share some very valuable information. Ruan Mei explains that the Eon of Veracity has been dead since a swarm disaster ended, and all that's left of it are its snakeskin-like husks, like the one sealed on Planarcadia, and also the shadow in Ashveil's arm, I think. I'm pretty sure the shadow and the husks are the same thing, but maybe don't quote me on that yet. Now, it seems like there are a bunch of husks, and they're all sealed using similar methods across many different planets, Planarcadia being one of them. And on Planarcadia, the husk is sealed by the power of of the abundance, and every so often, massive amounts of wish power are harvested in order to reinforce the seal. Similarly, on the rainforest planet of Vanwalk, plants grow unrestrained except for every few decades where everything is harvested en masse and presumably fed to the husk. Because Vanwalk, like Planarcadia, also boasts a Panarch Elwood, just like Evanescia. And its purpose on both planets is the same, to seal the power of the veracity. Ruan Mei explains that there are a bunch of worlds out there with the same structure, all carrying out this exact same ritual. And these rituals form the foundation for the Phantasmoon Games. Now, you may recall that during the Xianzhou War Dance, Himeko, Welt, and Herta delivered some Leviathan remains to Ruan Mei for study. Her resulting research revealed that around the same time Ashveil first ascended and established the path of the Trailblaze, every single life form associated with the veracity lost their taste buds. And she believes that someone removed the concept of taste from the path of veracity, thereby changing the meaning of the path, or perhaps even blending two paths together. After all, taste is a form of elation, and aftertaste is currently a power of elation, especially in the simulated universe. Now, March equates this concept with the prima mobile of veracity, which, if that's the case, means that the prima mobile of veracity and the prima mobile of elation overlapped at some point, suggesting that the path of elation may have engulfed the path of veracity. This is made more plausible by the fact that the primal desires of life, like eating, have always been entangled with each other. And that means that elation and veracity were always similar paths. And if this event hasn't happened already, it's likely an inevitability and also related to Asat Pramad's plan to destroy the elation. It's at this moment where Ashveil realizes that the story about En route stealing the veracity's tongue overlaps a weird amount with the story of Aha potentially stealing the veracity's sense of taste. So he concludes that En route is Asat Pramad. And as they work through their evidence, Ashveil starts to explain that the fragment of veracity found in his arm came from a former navigator of the Astral Express by the name of Icy. Now, Icy was a navigator for the Astral Express who had an extreme hatred for the elation. He took over navigation responsibilities soon after Ashveil and navigator Dolly died, and his ultimate goal was to reach the world's end. But after witnessing the ascension of Nanook, he resigned from his position, presumably founded the Omen Vanguards, who are followers of finality, told Ashveil where to find the Husk of Veracity, and then vanished. Realizing that En route and Icy were both attempting to reach the world's end and had a hatred of the elation and a connection to the veracity, Ashveil concludes that both En route and Icy are aliases of Asat Pramad, who then makes an unwanted appearance in front of just Ashveil. Where did everyone else go? I don't know, but we'll circle back to these guys later. For now, we need to deal with Shuhu, and since everyone else is busy, only the Trailblazer is going to enter the world on canvas to meet with Graphia, Silverwolf, and Blade. To that end, Pearl has made arrangements for the Trailblazer to travel to Inkford Hermitage, the border between reality and the world on canvas. Imaginae nearing the end of their lives congregate there, waiting to be ferried into the canvas by Graphia herself, so much of the region serves as a sort of retirement home or hospice care facility for Imaginae. Nihilux will also be staying here for a bit on Pearl's orders because she needs to finish the next volume of Fluffy Across the Blue to repay her debts, and won't be allowed to leave the Hermitage until she does. So off to Artist Prison she goes while the Trailblazer has a snowball fight with one of Graphia's snow giant Imaginae in the hopes that he'll be able to help them contact Graphia. And this works. The snow giant Imaginae Casper tells the Trailblazer about lighting the ground lamps near the location of Graphia's old home and asking her to come out to have a snowball fight, which is apparently a call to arms for a real fight. So that's what they do. They head up the mountain, light some lanterns in front of a Himeko statue, and bam! Nihilux appears. She already escaped Artist Prison thanks to the power of boredom. She talks a little bit about her current plotline where there are two Himekats, one real, one fake, in her latest script, before she's swiftly dragged away while Graphia watches. I'm putting the name Graphia in air quotes that you can't see because this Graphia is actually Asat Pramad in a very fabulous outfit. The cheeky sneaky here even tells a story about how he once borrowed the identity of one of Graphia's friends in order to infiltrate the resistance forces of Benzai Tengoku. So he's not really trying to hide it even. Not that the Trailblazer catches on, but you know, Graphia Asat then takes the opportunity to share a little story about Graphia's life. But we're going to skip it for now so we can talk about the complete story later on. He then tells the Trailblazer to head for the Myriad Wish Grove where Silverwolf and Blade are waiting for them. There, the Trailblazer can call for Graphia and she'll take them to the world on canvas by boat. Silverwolf is not coping well with Blade's presumed upcoming funeral. Spending an eternity being eaten and dissolved in the stomach acid of a Leviathan sounds like a fate worse than death to her, and to me too. So she's been brainstorming some alternate options like feeding Shuhu to the Panarch Elwood. Anything to stop Blade from sacrificing himself. She considers him family after all. She sees all the Stellaron hunters as family, and that even includes the Trailblazer, who arrives mid-conversation to take them to the world on canvas. After a quick summoning ritual, the real Graphia finally arrives by boat, acting like she's never met them before, because she hasn't. But she immediately recognizes the power of abundance within Blade and agrees to help him reach the husk of veracity. But she'll need stories of Blade's past in order to paint the path to get there. So he tells her of the place where he keeps the swords he made back when he was still known as Yingxing, entombed there in honor of the ones who fell while wielding them. Graphia takes this story and paints a field of spider lilies and masterless swords, a perfect image of Blade's ideal resting place. There, she leads them to the husk at the edge of the cliffside and explains that the veracity and abundance have been in a deadlock for 1,000 years, and that's likely the fate in store for Blade. But Blade remains weirdly unbothered by all this, even as he fulfills his final wishes by telling Silverwolf about some gifts that he'd made for the other Stellaron hunters. A blade for Kafka, a game controller for Silverwolf, a portable reactor for Firefly, and a scratching post, either for Elio or the Trailblazer, I'm really not sure. And then he doesn't say goodbye. He just recites that familiar code of the Astral Express one last time and falls into the jaws of the veracity. But he doesn't lose consciousness. Delirious from being digested and regenerated, Blade dreams of a forest of weapons, each one belonging to a dear friend and each one carrying some of Blade's fondest or at least formative memories. And at the end of his reminiscing, he shares his feelings of regret and the breadth of his life's work with the memory of his master, who then asks to see the one sword Blade neglected to show him all this time, a flawed sword he'd made from the remnants of the Shard Sword, the very relic that Yao Guang had brought with her to Planarcadia. Now here's the thing. Blade is a sneaky secret keeper. This whole time he's been acting like he's resigned himself to death or a life of eternal suffering, but no, he never intended for the veracity to be his grave. He intended to use it as a crucible for his rebirth. See, as much as Blade has craved death, he's always wanted revenge more. And if his death could also get him revenge, then more the better. But over time, Blade came to understand that even if he did manage to somehow secure his own death, it could never secure his revenge against Shuhu, because even if Shuhu died, Yaosha would always ensure that he'd return. So Blade ultimately concluded that the only way to truly get revenge on Shuhu was to strip him of his freedom. But to do that, Blade would need the most impenetrable prison, one Shuhu could never escape. And that perfect prison is Blade's own body. After all, it comes equipped with a full-time warden. So Blade began his plan and let the power of veracity melt his body down, which forced Shuhu to rebuild it over and over and over again, until the two became a single entity and all that was left was a battle of wills that Blade was certain to win. Because Blade is the master craftsman, while Shuhu is nothing more than a sword that Blade intends to point at the very abundance itself. Outside the Leviathan furnace, Graphia asks the Trailblazer about Evanesia's message and token, which she claims to have never seen before because the Graphia who saw it before was actually Asat Pramad, who shows up out of the blue and unannounced while dropping some very generous lore. According to him, about 1,000 years ago, Asat Pramad found baby Graphia in the ruins of Ahatopia and threw her into Nanook's Warforge. Now, the Warforge is a planet where Nanook forges Void Rangers, Doomsday Beasts, and other followers of the Destruction, which is really worth paying attention to in context because Void Rangers are melted down in the Warforge, often alongside the fragments of Leviathans, and that's how you get these Leviathan hybrids like the Doomsday Beasts. And it's noteworthy because, well, Blade is reforging himself using Leviathan powers as we speak. And Graphia was apparently granted the ability to paint monsters into existence using pieces of the veracity after she finished being forged. I'm sensing a pattern here. Now, Graphia's reforging turned her into a powerful, loyal soldier of the Legion wielding the power of veracity, and she fought for the Legion right up until she witnessed the Astral Express crash land in Planarcadia. Graphia was entranced by the sight of the Express slamming into the ground like a wounded iron dragon, or a tower of infinity, and she could only describe this wondrous sight with the word Murata, which later became her family name. Now, presumably Asat Pramad didn't throw Graphia into the Warforge as a baby. Based on the embellished story that he told earlier, he likely raised her somewhat normally for a while, telling her stories of his past as a nameless and stuff, which is probably why she was so enamored with the sight of the fallen Express when it happened. But as she watched the stranded nameless exit the broken train, she realized that her adoptive father, Asat Pramad, was trying to use these surviving nameless to instigate a rebellion in Ahatopia. And Graphia couldn't stand anyone, not even her father, treating the nameless of the Astral Express that way. So she decided then and there to protect the Express, and used her powers of veracity and Imagenesis to protect it and Ahatopia, sealing the entire planet within the world on canvas and using herself as a pin to hold it shut. In doing so, she turned her brush against the destruction and began suffering the effects of the weathering curse. It was a sign of her turning against the path of destruction that Asat Pramad had bound her to. Interestingly, the visible symptoms of the weathering curse that we see later on look an awful lot like Firefly's entropy loss syndrome. And given that Firefly's powers come from the propagation and she was fighting against the propagation, we might be able to make the claim that the weathering curse is entropy loss syndrome, and it's an affliction that only comes about when you go against a path you're bound to. This has some interesting implications, so put a pin on it, we'll talk about it later. But after losing Graphia to the world on canvas, Asat Pramad mostly left Ahatopia alone, until he came across a very young Himeko. But before we can get any more information out of him, Graphia attacks, and Silverwolf and the Trailblazers seize the opportunity to take him out, since that's ultimately more important than getting information out of him, you know? But this is where Asat Pramad finally reveals that his most powerful ability is his control over probability, something we touched on earlier. But he can't just control which probabilities are the ones that actually happen, he can also control luck. Apparently, he can effectively stockpile things like bad luck over long periods of time and then release it all at once to devastating effect. And he does this a lot. And this is why planets he targets often have long periods of prosperity that precede spontaneous outbursts of catastrophe. That's a result of accumulated bad luck hitting them all at once. And he's gonna try it again in Planarcadia. But first, he attacks Graphia, which causes her to lose control over her power of destruction. She then summons a small legion of Imaginae and a draconic recreation of the Astral Express that closely resembles the Bullet Worm, and all Silverwolf and the Trailblazer can do is hold them off. But fortunately, Blade is not just a masterful craftsman, he's also really quick. Having finally conquered and imprisoned Shuhu, he bursts forth from the husk of veracity and cuts down Graphia's Imaginae one by one. And when she hurls her Draconic Express at him, he stops it with his bare hands and cleaves it in two. When the dust settles, Blade declares that he will take over Shuhu's slot as a supplicant in the Phantasmoon Games, although he never explains his rationale for doing so. An exhausted Graphia explains that Asat Pramad doesn't just have the ability to manipulate probability. In fact, they need to be very careful because he can also split himself among multiple vessels, which allows him to appear in multiple places simultaneously. And the form that we encountered within the world on canvas was merely one of these vessels. And losing a single vessel in the fight is hardly a big loss. Now, while all this was going on in the world on canvas, Himeko had been meeting with Pearl to discuss some suspicions she'd been having about her father. While investigating the Phantasmoon Games, she'd flipped through his art portfolio and realized that many of the planets he'd visited were destroyed by the Antimatter Legion shortly after he'd left. Pearl theorizes that Ryusuke could have been tracking Asat Pramad in an effort to find a way to break the weathering curse, or maybe he was being manipulated by him the whole time. But theorizing will get them nowhere, so Himeko decides to confront her father and learn the truth for herself. So she calls him up and invites him to a daddy-daughter day, and as they reminisce, Himeko finally asks him what he's really been up to for the last 15 years. And that's when he tells her that he is sick, with the weathering curse of all things, allegedly. But this is kind of weird, right? Because like what we know of as the weathering curse only affects Graphia's bloodline, and Ryusuke married into the Graphia family. But as we talked about earlier, it is possible that the weathering curse is a form of entropy loss syndrome that flares up when someone goes against their bound path. And if that's the case, then not only is Ryusuke bound to a path, he's actively fighting against it. Keep this in mind for later. Ryusuke then asks Himeko about what happened to her after he left. And she explains how, 4 years prior to the Bloodstained Games, she found the abandoned Astral Express car in the world on canvas and tried to repair it. When that failed, she decided to enter and win the Phantasmoon Games, hoping her 1 minute of Eonhood would be enough to repair the Express. But then the supplicant Marcus Antali came in contact with Shuhu's remains and went on a murder spree, and stopping him became her priority. But she soon realized that the only way to stop him for good was to use all her wish power to summon a giant mecha that could crush him in one decisive strike. But burning her wish power meant forfeiting her victory and leaving the Astral Express stranded in the world on canvas. It was a tough choice to make, but Himeko decided to sacrifice her dream to save her homeworld. But the image of the mecha that she imaginated was so striking that it became an urban legend, and also likely the source of all the imaginated mechas that we see today. But as she's telling this story, Ryusuke cuts in, claiming that it would have been impossible for Himeko to defeat the Herald of Death and repair the Express. So he believes that she must have had someone helping her. And in fact, he knew there was someone helping her, because there was evidence of 2 people living and working together in their house despite his absence. He then suggests that Himeko may have painted an idealized self-portrait and then brought it to life. And he also implies that her mecha miracle won her the Phantasmoon Games and allowed her to repair and launch the Astral Express. But this is just what Ryusuke believes to be true. Just like how he believes his daughter died of the weathering curse in Planarcadia, and that the Himeko that we know is merely an imagine she left behind. And the thing is, he's not entirely wrong. But at this point, Himeko has figured out that Ryusuke also isn't who he says he is. Well, not entirely. This Ryusuke is in fact one of Asat Pramad's many forms. It's an identity that he borrowed from the real Ryusuke. But while Asat Pramad is not Ryusuke, he is, to some degree, Himeko's father. Apparently, the real Ryusuke was killed by Asat Pramad when Himeko was only 6 years old, and Asat Pramad had been masquerading as him ever since. So he basically adopted her, just like he adopted Graphia 1,000 years prior. And with his secret finally out in the open, Asat Pramad launches an attack, not just against Himeko, but against all of the nameless scattered across Planarcadia. He then says that he's been preventing any bad luck from befalling Planarcadia for the last 15 years, and now he plans to unleash all that stockpiled luck at once. And that's where the quest ends, on the cliffhanger of all cliffhangers. Although we did get a couple of half answers in regards to our questions about Himeko at least, but if I may speculate just a little bit before we go, Asat Pramad may be a lot of things, but a liar he is not. So I'm going to assume that both his observations and assumptions are mostly correct. Which means the claim that our Himeko was an imaginated idealized self-portrait of the original Himeko that she left all her wishes to is also true. Or at least I think the part about her being an imaginated creation of the original Himeko is true, but I don't think she's a self-portrait. Note that in this flashback, she's simply called the red-haired woman, not Himeko. That's a bit odd, because if she was a self-portrait, then she should have the same name as Himeko, right? But as you might recall, this red-haired woman actually signed her name in the Astral Express guest book as Murata, not Himeko. So I can't help but suspect that Himeko didn't exactly paint a self-portrait, but instead painted the spirit of her whole bloodline, the spirit of Murata, the one that longed for the trailblaze. Which means that our Himeko may not just carry the wishes of the original Himeko, but also Graphia. See, our Himeko has given 2 distinct accounts of how she encountered the Astral Express. In one account, she found the abandoned express in the world on canvas and spent years trying to repair it. This is consistent with the original Himeko's experience. But the other account says that she watched the Astral Express crash land into the world on canvas. And that event was not witnessed by the original Himeko. It was witnessed by Graphia over 1,000 years ago. And here's the other thing. Both the original and imaginated Himeko have weathering curse marks on them, which suggests that they're both going against their bound paths. Now, obviously, the original Himeko would be bound to the destruction by bloodline, so her curse makes sense since she's not really destroying anything. But if the imaginated Himeko was actually meant to be the embodiment of Murata, then she would be carrying their wishes of trailblazing among the stars. Which means she would have been bound to the trailblaze, and her weathering curse appears here because she is not able to trailblaze. And speaking of not trailblazing, Asat Pramad did suggest that he's also suffering from the weathering curse. And that suggests that he's going against the path he's been bound to. But which path is he bound to? I know it seems like a silly question to ask of a Lord Ravager, but he was originally walking the path of elation as en route, then the trailblaze as icy, and then he had a stint following the finality, apparently, and now he's connected to the destruction. My guess is that he's turning his back on the destruction, if only because he has this one line in the teaser trailers where he's like really excited about fighting the destruction for some reason. And I think it would be kind of crazy if he did it because of his daughters. But that's my speculation, so what's yours? Please share your thoughts with the class because that is all you're gonna get from me today. So thank you all very much for watching. Please watch out for dice heads because they are very dangerous, and I will see you all in the next episode. Don't forget to moisturize to prevent cracking. Bye bye!